And so the best thing to do would be to get rid of that entirely. No money in politics. But in the absence of that, yes, leaders, business leaders have to be part of civil society, but really citizens have to be part of it because ultimately we're more powerful. I think the corporate role, corporations have a role in pushing systemic change. That's a big call in my book. But I think the real power is with the citizenry, and that's where we need to be right now in the United States, where you have a robust movement like the anti-Vietnam War movement that will drive government to reform.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Our guest for this episode is Auden Schendler, the author of a new book called Terrible Beauty: Reckoning with Climate Complicity and Rediscovering Our Soul. Published by Harvard Business Review Press, it is part memoir, part reflection, and part prescription from 30 years of working in corporate sustainability. If you aren't familiar with Auden, he learned about corporate sustainability at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which was co-founded by Amory Lovins, who was named one of the world's most influential people by Time in 2009 and considered the Einstein of energy efficiency. Auden then moved to Aspen Ski Company, where he worked from 1999 to just earlier this year as its vice president and then senior vice president of sustainability. Auden has been named a climate innovator by Time magazine and a climate saver by the EPA. In this episode, we talk about Auden's journey from growing up in New Jersey, playing baseball over the Lincoln Tunnel during the environmental decay of the 1970s, and spending time with extended family in North Dakota, a place where he found refuge in the natural world, to his work in local politics in Colorado and in the ski industry. Our conversation, though, centers on the ideas in the book Terrible Beauty. As Auden says, climate change threatens everything we care about, so we need to be willing to do the hard work as citizens to bring about real change. He also shares a few ideas about how corporate leaders can go beyond corporate sustainability as usual that just upholds our fossil fuel economy to get to a place where they're using the power of their brands to push for systemic change. However, this book is really unlike any other sustainability book or article I've ever read. Auden makes a more joyful case about how we engage our role as citizens to build community and ultimately drive change that allows us all to thrive, be it as a parent, as a corporate leader, or just by contributing to the place that we live. So you can buy the book at audenschendler.com as well as Amazon or wherever else you prefer to buy your books. And you can read a few endorsements on his website from people far more noteworthy than me, such as Conrad Anker, Bill McKibben, and former White House National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. And as always, if you enjoy this episode or any of our other past episodes, please leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. Or if you're watching on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up. So without further delay, please enjoy the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Auden Schendler, author of the new book, Terrible Beauty. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are really excited to be joined by Auden Schendler, author of the new book, Terrible Beauty: Reckoning with Climate Complicity and Rediscovering Our Soul. Thanks for joining us today, Auden.
Hey, good to be here. Thank you.
So your book, Terrible Beauty, it opens with an encounter with your friends and a dust devil, and you talk a little bit about your childhood fascination with tornadoes. You've also had a 30-year career in corporate sustainability. So when you think about your relationship with nature from your childhood fascination with tornadoes, or I think you write in the book about playing Little League baseball above the Lincoln Tunnel in New Jersey.
Right, yeah.
And then where you are now, where you've been working in the ski industry for as part of your 30-year career in sustainability. So over that time, how do you think about your relationship with nature? How do you think it's changed? And where do you kind of sit now reflecting back on that period of time?
Yeah. And, that question is hard to answer without coming off as a total cheese ball, like a John Denver song from the 70s. But, I grew up in New Jersey at a time of really profound American environmental decay. And I saw the natural world as a refuge. I would visit my grandparents in North Dakota and remember thinking, what is this? This is the stuff. Jersey isn't the stuff. How do we make the world cleaner and freer like North Dakota? And so that was, if I had to describe my long-standing relationship, it's the natural world is the place I'm from. I was more from North Dakota than I was from New Jersey, even though I was born there. And so the track of my career has always been, how do I be in that world? And it's been a privilege to work in the ski industry. I get a lot of emails from grad students or business people say, I want to work in the ski industry in sustainability. There are not that many jobs. I got lucky.
I was watching one of your talks on YouTube recently, and you talk about this Bob Dylan song, Tomorrow is a Long Time, which Timothée Chalamet, when he hosted SNL, actually covered. But you talk about one of the lyrics, I can't hear the echo of my own footsteps. Thinking about that time and the footsteps that you've created, do you have a sense of what that echo is now in this career and that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, what people should know about my book is that it's part memoir and it's part storytelling, and it's meant to be fun. I mean, if you start your book chasing a dust devil with the goal of getting inside it, that could be a fun book. And part of what the title means, Terrible Beauty, is the gap or the dissonance between the things we love so much, whether it's the natural world or your family or your community or your faith, and the threat to that. So climate change threatens everything we care about. And the Dylan quote, which the full quote is, I can't hear the echo of my footsteps or remember the sound of my own name. And to me, it's a profound statement of alienation from a generation, Dylan and Springsteen, defined American alienation that works today because we have this, alienation from the things we care about because we're agents. Society is agent of this, destruction of really not just environment, but economy and morality even. So, I think that is a critical message of the book is how do you reconcile that? But you have to understand it first.
And on that reconciliation, I think it's really interesting. I went back and found what is, I guess, in sustainability circles, probably a pretty iconic Bloomberg Business Week piece from October 2007, where you say essentially that greening a company is almost impossible. And yet you've spent decades essentially trying to do that, as well as impacting the wider industry. And in the book, you talk about, getting involved in local politics and other areas of advocacy. So with so much time engaged in this work, and, we'll get in kind of some of the conclusions you have and recommendations that you have. But if you saw it as such an impossibility back in 2007, what does it look like now? Do you still think it's impossibility? Do you have more or less hope, I guess, might be a good way to phrase that.
Yeah. Well, you're sort of asking, why am I bothering with the corporate sector? And that's a really good question. And to understand it, you have to know that I came into the field of corporate sustainability at its nascence when it was this incredibly optimistic idea. So simply, it was that the only group that really is going to care about climate is business, because they can save money by reducing energy use through energy efficiency, light bulb efficiency, even in certain cases at that time, renewable energy. And so this was a profoundly optimistic, like TED Talk catnip kind of idea that was, we're going to use our brains to replace resources and energy. We're going to use intelligence to replace those things. So like examples of that might be, do you know that just by orienting your house properly in a southerly direction, you can reduce your heating bill by 10%? Or by putting in waterless urinals in a skyscraper, you don't just save water, you save pumping energy. And that's all money that goes to the bottom line, and on and on and on. So I really liked that, and I bought into it 100%. And I did it. And it was incredibly gratifying. It was incredibly difficult. That's my first book, Getting Green Done, which was really the first book to say, this is really hard. And we're sort of lying about that. And that's what the Business Week article is about. And so over time, I got to this realization that this was not enough. And we'll get into this probably later, but part of the thesis of my book is not only wasn't it enough, but it was complicit with the status quo. In other words, business appeared to be diligently doing environmental work, but none of that work got in the way of the fossil fuel economy. And so I thought we need to think differently about this. Now, you could argue, to answer your question, business isn't the right tool. It's like using a screwdriver to drive a nail on sustainability. But the answer I give to that, and this actually came from a guy named Paul Moynister, who runs the Topo Finance Project. And I said to him, why are we even working on business? And he said, we don't have a lot of tools in the climate fight. We have, government, civil society, philanthropy, the legal system. You may have the faith community, a few other things. And then you have this massively valuable, influential, wealthy, motivated tool called business. And are we really going to toss that one out and say, there's no chance? And so my work has sort of been hope-based in the sense that if we could ever weaponize even some of these businesses in a systemic way, it could trigger broad-scale change in society and governance.
And you talked there about business not necessarily not being enough, and it sort of maintain the status quo when it comes to the fossil fuel based economy. And you write in the book that Americans are guilty of buying into a version of environmentalism that doesn't require meaningful change, to that point about the status quo. So what have you learned or how have you been thinking about how we can make it more digestible that greater change and probably some discomfort needs to happen?
Yeah. After writing the book, the more I've thought about why we are where we are, I've almost become a historian, like more interested in history than in necessarily the content of the book. And the history of American citizenship is that it was difficult. Think about whether it was paying a lot of taxes up until, the era post-World War II under Eisenhower. The top tier tax rate was enormously high. That's painful, but that helped build the good society we live in. You had to participate in town halls. You had to run for public office. You had to be the mayor of your town. And I think Americans have a combination of amnesia. We forgot what it took, and we got lazy because we were delivered post-World War II a pretty amazing society, right? Unless you were black, unless you were, in prison. Like, obviously, we weren't perfect, and we have many unreconciled issues, but we had infrastructure, we had firefighting, we had stable legal systems, which are almost unique in the world. And we forgot that it takes a lot of work. And so environmentalism fit the kind of civics of the rest of our lives, which was that it was lazy environmentalism. It was token, it was self-focused instead of systemic, and it never put us in any situation that was difficult or hard. Even recently I was going to speak at a protest on democracy in Glenwood Springs, and I was quoted in the paper before that, and someone responded to what I said, furious, basically saying everything I said was a lie. Well, that's a difficult thing to withstand as a person, as a citizen, to know there's someone out there. But your role is to have that civic discourse. Some of it's going to be unmanageably, in your face, and be a citizen. And so a lot of what my book is about is, are you tough enough to be a citizen? Can you keep this republic the way Ben Franklin said we should? Because that's what we need to do. It's no longer recycle your plastic bottle that doesn't get recycled and is buying into a lie and thinking you're a big environmentalist.
It's funny that you mentioned the example of the town hall. I was just watching the latest episode of the show on HBO called The Last of Us, based on the video game, and they have a town hall where they all come together and they have a list of people who speak and present their perspective, and there's an uneasy tension in the room, but they focus on like, how can we have a discussion here about representing everyone's point of view, and then come to a mutual conclusion, which, as you talk about, is quite hard. I think social media and sitting behind a computer has probably made those kind of town halls even more intimidating for a lot of people. And that actually leads into sort of another thing that you brought up in the book called the supermarket problem, which is, these corporate leaders are sort of fearful of having a conversation with the busy mom or the climate denier when they're at the supermarket doing the shopping about, maybe difficult changes they made that resulted in higher prices or products coming in less convenient packaging, things like that. So how do we get people, I guess, like, to become more engaged citizens, or if you're in a corporate position, to lead on these issues, like to get over the supermarket problem, to speak up at a town hall? Like, what do we need to do to change the dynamics to get people to take on some of these tough actions?
Well, that's sort of the nut question. And the supermarket problem really is a metaphor for this broader, constraint, which is to say, if you, for example, I'm leaving Aspen Skiing Company as of May 1, but we've gone to the trade group and said, you're not doing enough on climate. You're allowing businesses to act, operationally and maybe write letters, but you're not taking a position. Well, the response to that is ostracization, fury, demonization. Schendler's crazy. You're an idiot. That's so difficult. And so the thing we're asking people to do is to engage as a human being. And part of what I get at in the book is we built religions and philosophy and thought systems about how we ought to live over thousands of years. And it's hopeful because those are good ideas, the notion of treating your neighbor as they would like to be treated. But we don't really follow those directives. And so I think it's incredibly gratifying in the modern world to engage in society. And I also think there's this desire. My son recently said, I'm sick of my phone, and we're all sick of our phones. And the antidote to that is to go to the post office or the supermarket with a little extra time so that you can actually talk to people. And that is democracy. And that is community. I believe that there's something incredibly gratifying and soul-fulfilling and meaningful in re-entering the world as a citizen.
Yeah, it's true. I from my wife's academic career, we moved to a small town in Texas, and the most interesting things I learn about the town are when I'm standing in line at the post office dropping something off, and I hear about, they're going to tear down this building, or they're going to build this building, or they're thinking about making this change. And we don't necessarily have the same examples as maybe past generations did, where you would go and engage in those spaces. Like now, to your point, everyone's on their phone, everyone's online. It creates this barrier where we can't necessarily have these sort of uncomfortable but necessary conversations, which I know, as you've mentioned a couple examples, you're not unfamiliar with, as you have gone and actually participated in local government. What has that experience taught you? Is there things you would transfer over from that to like how leaders could make change in the corporate world? Or is it that corporate leaders actually just need to get engaged more with local government in these issues to make the more systemic change?
Yeah, well, to answer your first question, you're right. There are fewer and fewer mechanisms in society to engage. So there still are the Elks and Rotary and Lions, but if you've attended any of those are old people, and some of the things they're doing are not like conducive to modern youth. Like Happy Bucks is not kind of a cool thing to a Gen Xer even. So part of this is that we have to manufacture those connections. Just a short anecdote. A number of years ago when I had kids, I was reading the Harvard Happiness Study, which says that what keeps you thriving as a human and living a long life and healthy is human connection. And I thought, what if something terrible happens to me? I really don't have a lot of friends because I've been working and I've been raising these little kids and I run around, I don't talk to anybody. So I created a men's vice and drinking club where we'd meet once every 6 weeks at a bar, have a couple of beers, wide open conversation, and then we'd reconvene. And what was interesting about it is when I asked people to do it, they all showed up because they knew exactly what I was doing. And I even had people in the bar come up, strangers, and say, "What are you doing? I think I know what you're doing. Can I be part of this?" And one guy compared it to the meetings that Groucho Marx and various other celebrities used to have at the Algonquin Hotel, the Algonquin Round Table. So you have to manufacture that for your own good, for your own durability and survival. And then the question of how to, corporate engagement in civil society is fraught, right? Because it's been corporate influence in the world. It's been fossil fuel influence in politics that got us to this bad position we're in today. And so the best thing to do would be to get rid of that entirely. No money in politics. But in the absence of that, yes, leaders, business leaders have to be part of civil society, but really citizens have to be part of it because ultimately we're more powerful. Corporations have a role in pushing systemic change. That's a big call in my book. But I think the real power is with the citizenry, and that's where we need to be right now in the United States, where you have a robust movement like the anti-Vietnam War movement that will drive government to reform.
And so using like the Auden Schendler and Patagonia example of creating Holdfast with the aim of being able to put money into some of this activism, which, as you just said, is double-edged sword. So do you think it's sort of like in the short term, we need these corporate leaders to stand up and make noise and have some of these uncomfortable conversations? But as part of that, we need to start like capacity building for better grassroots engagement and citizenry in the long run?
Well, I think there are two parts. There's the corporate part and then there's the citizen part. Yes, we need a civics revolution in the United States among the people. The corporations, I don't know, this is an interesting problem because right now, climate isn't the issue. Democracy is the issue. And whatever your politics, I think we can agree that we agreed on the Constitution, which says that the courts are co-equals in power, that Congress chooses where money goes, that you don't deport people without due process, you can't arrest them without due process. And so we need corporations to stand up and lead. And corporations don't seem to be getting that if they capitulate, it's bad for them too. And the tariffs are a great example. So authoritarian nations, business doesn't do that well. And I think people are having some buyer's remorse on Trump based on his odd, archaic tariff policies. So corporations, where the hell are they? And they need to start standing up. And this is the same question as climate, which is, I believe once a couple decide that they're going to take action, others will follow. And business is scared to act because of retaliation on climate, but also on civics. And the short answer to that is those lawsuits can be stomped. I was talking to a lawyer yesterday, and I was saying, look, we operate, business I used to work for operates on federal lands. If that gets taken away, we're in trouble. And he said, yeah, if you take a position that draws retaliation from the federal government, I will get you a stay in 6 days on basic First Amendment law that is unassailable. And you got to have that level of faith, Corporations have been leaders in certain things. We should lead again.
Do you think, let's say, in another 3.75 years, we have a new administration in the U.S., we have a, Democratic leadership who believes in democracy, do you think the pendulum can swing back where we can get back to like government action and regulation on these sort of things? Or do you think something else has to change? Like, is it that grassroots part? Is it more corporate leadership in the interim? Like, do you think we can get the pendulum back to things like creating the EPA and like, basically recreating the EPA probably in 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at this moment is that it's very dismal and we're losing our democracy. And another is to say that authoritarians like Trump, they don't typically last. They can do damage, but they don't last. One. And two, this is also a time of disruption and revolution in the United States that presents opportunity. I'm a skier. When you ski the bumps, the way you turn is you come up the backside of the bumps and you're unweighted. And at that moment when you're weightless, you pivot your skis and make your next turn. And you could argue that America is unweighted right now. It's imbalanced, maybe, but we have this chance to pivot. And I think the hope is that, yeah, we're in a moment of revolution. And what's driven that? Well, American citizens haven't been given the basic things we've asked for of government to allow us to thrive. And what are those things? Well, their health care, their education, their housing, stable housing, stable health care, and it's a relatively clean environment. Think about those things I listed. Those represent the four failures in our alleged capitalist free market: pollution, housing, education, and healthcare. Those things have been market failures. And if you wanted to actually practice free market capitalism, you wouldn't let people pollute for free. You wouldn't allow corporations to run healthcare at twice the cost of nationalized healthcare. So I think the answer to your question is yes, we're at a moment where we could say we need general reform. Bernie Sanders talks about what those reforms look like, where we treat people like human beings, we replace their dignity that has been lost, and we create the great nation that we've aspired to, that's described in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, but that we've never achieved.
And that leads me, you mentioned thriving there, and having read some of your stuff and watched a couple of your talks, like what is thriving in your definition of sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, part of my book, I tell stories about my family, and the stories I tell are goofball, silly, idiotic stories that all of us have. So one story is about my son collecting gnomes and my daughter practicing martial arts. And so my son became world famous because a newspaper person covered his gnome collection, and my daughter, who's a total overachiever, got nothing. So that funny human story that all humans have versions of. And I say, look, that's the ability, the leisure to tell those stories and to live that kind of a silly life. That's a luxury provided by a stable world. And an unstable world, climate, democracy falling apart, that doesn't give you the license to thrive. And those stories, that relaxation, the time for poetry and literature and art, that's what moves societies forward. It's the new thinking that lets us ponder what is the good society. And so if you don't have that, you stagnate. And so human flourishing depends on that. And an important point is, I'm not saying everyone should go skiing or everyone should have a vacation in Florida. You don't have to be rich and white to have a break in your life, to not be constantly under pressure for survival and subsistence, to just have a pause where you can reconsider your world.
There was this one quote in the book that I've pulled out because it's quite a strong statement that you put forward. Corporate sustainability is currently practiced, research taught, and reported on remains the best way to enable the success of the fossil fuel industry in accelerating climate catastrophe. So as currently practiced is a big part of that, because it does suggest that there's an opportunity to change. So when you think about all the things that we've talked about, all the things that you've worked on, like, where do you see those top 2 or 3 opportunities for change?
Well, let's take an example. The opportunity in business is powerful, it's influential, it has tons of money, And many people love these businesses. For example, for whatever its flaws, I love Starbucks. I'm a fan. I travel and I go to Starbucks and I like it. And I like Howard Schultz. But Apple's an example. So people love their iPhones. It's a great product and it's a great business. Tim Cook, instead of greening its operations and putting more recycled content, aluminum in the phones, could write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and say, you know what, after the California fires, we really need climate action. It's affecting our supply chain, our customers, our business, and insurance policy, so therefore governance and bottom line. And we need to do that. And we're going to mobilize our customers in this fight, and we're going to go to Washington, and we're actually going to spend a lot of lobbying dollars on this, and we're going to pull out of the business roundtable that is opposed climate action. If he were to do that, I guarantee you other businesses would follow. I guarantee that there would be praise, not backlash. We've seen this a little bit already with Costco rejecting changes to DEI and Target just getting annihilated for caving. So that's what I'm talking about. And the complicity that I describe in the book's title, that's business as usual, where you just look at your operations and don't do any of the hard, dirty work of engaging in civil change, in advocacy, in politics, and governance.
And I want to sort of bring our conversation to a close on that other part of the title, Rediscovering Our Soul. So you recommend making climate action a joyful habit. So what are your joyful habits around climate action? Do you have any recommendations for people who maybe need to find a joyful habit?
Well, my vision is that you wake up in the morning and you drink a couple of cups of strong coffee, and then you get on it. You engage in this fight, which today it's partly democracy and it's partly climate. And the question you're always holding in your head is, how can I be most effective at big change? And so you have to answer that yourself, but it's a range of civic engagement, like I'm going to a protest on May 1st. It's participating in public decision making, whether it's running for office or attending these meetings. It's being in the community and educating yourself. It's organizing events, whether it's my men's drinking club or the town halls where you bring in speakers. It's talking to elected officials. It's voting. And I submit this makes your life valuable and meaningful and rich and worthy. And one counter to that I get is, well, climate's impossible. We've already warmed 1.5 C. We're headed toward 3.3. And I find it hopeful. I've had some feedback that this isn't a very hopeful idea, but I find it hopeful that humans have always engaged in these durable, long-standing, impossible fights, whether it's mortality or what the Bible talks about in terms of fighting evil, right? The Bible's about persistently fighting evil that always returns. The Lord of the Rings is the same story. So is Harry Potter. So these things, these stories that we like, that we live, and that we tell ourselves, that's what it means to be human. And I don't see it as a problem that we may not achieve these victories in our lifetime. My favorite quotes that I use in the book, Cormac McCarthy says, all things of grace and beauty, such that one holds them to one's heart, have a common provenance in pain. Anything worthwhile is difficult. And then Reinhold Niebuhr said, nothing important will be achieved in your lifetime. And instead of being discouraging, that should be encouraging. This is what we do. This is what it means to be a human. You want to be involved in the fight, right? You don't want to just be like tending your yard, having some fun, and then on your deathbed, you're like, yeah, it was fun. No, we want to be involved in profound meaning in our lives. And so I think it's a cool time to be alive. I'm not discouraged by all the badness coming through the windows. I see it as part of the human struggle. And it can even be fun. There's a joy to this, battle.
Awesome. Great frame to end on and give people a little bit of a call to action. In addition to checking out out your book, which we'll include in a link into the show notes to check out. Thank you so much, Auden, for joining us, talking a little bit about your journey, your book, how you're thinking about the current moment. We really appreciate it.
Well, Rick, thank you for your show, for your attention, and for your thoughtful questions. Thank you.